Karen called the police when I closed my driveway. I didn't think moving into my dream home would come with a side order of drama, but here am. It all started about 6 months ago, when my partner and I finally obtained what felt like the perfect house. Picture this: a quiet residential street lined with towering oak trees that formed a natural canopy over the road. A symphony of birds singing in the mornings and neighbors who waved like they genuinely meant it. As we unloaded our moving truck, it felt like a Hallmark action, and I was ready to settle in and start our happily ever after. The house itself was everything we'd hoped for. A cozy 2-story with a wraparound porch, complete with a little garden that I couldn't wait to make my own. The day we moved in, it was sunny and warm, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is where we're supposed to be. Little did I know that lurking behind those amiable expressions and freshly mowed lawns was a neighborhood authoritarian in disguise. A week after settling in, I received an invitation, or more like a call, to the monthly Homeowners Association meeting. I'd never lived in a neighborhood with an homeowner association before, so I wasn't sure what to expect. The flyer mentioned neighborhood initiatives and maintaining the neighborhood's charm, which sounded harmless enough. My partner and I decided to go, figuring it'd be a good way to meet more of the neighbors. That's where I met her, Judith. Judith was everything you'd imagine the president of an overly enthusiastic homeowner association to be. She strutted into the room like she owned the place, clipboard in hand and a pair of oversized glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She looked around the room as if she were mentally cataloging everyone's flaws, her sharp eyes narrowing every time someone whispered or shifted in their seat. She wasted no time asserting her power, launching into a speech about how important it was to uphold the prestige of our neighborhood. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just passionate. Maybe she'd been burned before by negligent residents who let their grass grow too long or painted their shutters neon pink. But as the meeting went on, her tone became more harsh, more patronizing. She talked about enforcing standards like she was running a gated estate in Beverly Hills instead of a modest suburb where most of the houses were built in the 90s. Then came the shock. New Effie's Judith unveiled a plan to increase homeowner association dues by 20%, citing vague neighborhood improvements like upgrading the neighborhood park and repainting the neighborhood sign. When someone asked for specifics, she brushed them off with a dismissive wave and said something about how we all benefit from these upgrades. I couldn't stay quiet. I'm sorry, but where's the budget breakdown for these projects? If we're paying more, shouldn't we know exactly where the money's going? Judith's eyes snapped to me like a hawk spotting a mouse. For a moment, I thought she might actually hiss. The homeowner association board has already reviewed the budget. We don't need to burden residents with those details, she said, her voice dripping with irritation. It's about trust or transparency, I muttered, under my breath, earning a couple of stifled laughs from nearby neighbors. Judith glared at me, and I knew I'd just painted a mark on my back. A few weeks after that meeting, things started to get weird. One morning, I noticed a set of tire marks on my driveway. They weren't from our cars, and they definitely weren't there the night before. I followed the trail to the end of the street where a small construction crew was working on a house renovation. A cement mixer and a couple of pickup trucks were parked halfway blocking the sidewalk. I walked over to the foreman, a rough-looking guy in a dusty baseball cap, and asked if his trucks had been on my property. Yeah, probably, he said with a shrug. It's the easiest way to turn around. Sorry about that. I blinked. Sorry doesn't fix the damage to my driveway. Can you make sure it doesn't happen again? Yeah, sure, he said. But his tone made it clear he wasn't planning to do anything about it. The next morning, there were more tire marks, and the day after that, fresh cracks in the pavement. I tried talking to the foreman again, but he just waved me off. It's just a driveway, he said, like I was being unreasonable. Frustrated, I decided to take action. I went to the hardware store and bought a sturdy chain and a couple of posts. That afternoon, I installed the chain across the entrance to my driveway, securing it with a padlock. It wasn't the prettiest solution, but it got the job done. The construction vehicle stopped using my driveway, and for a couple of days, things were quiet again. Then Judith escalated things in a way I hadn't expected. She called the police. I was in the middle of watering my garden when a patrol car pulled up to the curb. Two officers stepped out, looking unsure as they approached. "We received a complaint about a potential obstruction," one of them said, glancing at the chain across my driveway. Before I could respond, Judith appeared. "This chain is obstructing access and violates neighborhood rules," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "I'm sure you'll agree this needs to be removed immediately." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "The chain is on my private property," I explained to the officers. "It's there to prevent construction vehicles from trespassing and causing damage. I've tried speaking with the foreman, but they've ignored me." One of the officers stepped closer to inspect the posts. After a moment, he nodded. "This doesn't appear to be obstructing. Neighborhood access is clearly on private property." Judith's face flushed a deep red. "But it's unsightly. It's not in line with homeowner association guidelines." "Ma'am," the other officer interrupted, holding up a hand, "this doesn't fall under our jurisdiction. This is a civil matter. We recommend resolving it through the homeowner association." The officers left, having found no wrongdoing, leaving Judith visibly frustrated. She glared at me before storming off without another word. Later that day, I found a formal notice taped to my door. A $1,000 fine for unauthorized modification. That was the last straw. I spent the next few evenings diving into research, poring over homeowner association bylaws and local property ordinances. As it turned out, Judith's claims didn't hold water. The chain was on my property, and there was nothing in the bylaws explicitly prohibiting it. Armed with this knowledge, I doubled down, adding private property signs to the posts for good measure. The neighborhood, which had been so warm and welcoming when we first moved in, started to feel different. Some neighbors stopped waving, their smiles replaced with furtive glances. Others quietly expressed their support, telling me they'd had their own run-ins with Judith, but hadn't wanted to rock the boat. It seemed I'd become the unofficial spokesperson for everyone who was tired of her tyranny. The tension was palpable, and I knew this was only the beginning. Judith wasn't the type to back down, and neither was I. I hadn't fully understood the extent of her determination or spitefulness until the weeks that followed. Things went from irritating to downright surreal, and every time I thought I'd reached the peak of her absurdity, Judith managed to outdo herself. It started subtly at first. The construction vehicles, which had avoided my driveway since I'd put up the chain and signs, began creeping back. I'd find fresh tire marks just outside the chain, or scuffs on the posts where they'd clearly tried to maneuver around. It felt deliberate, like they were testing my resolve. When I approached the foreman again, he just shrugged and said we were told it wouldn't be an issue. Told by whom? He wouldn't say, but I had my suspicions. Then came the real damage. One morning, I discovered that one of the posts holding the chain had been knocked over. It wasn't just loose, it was completely uprooted, like someone had rammed it with something heavy. I installed a replacement, but the next day, the chain itself had been cut clean through. It wasn't a random act of destruction. Someone had gone to significant effort to send me a message. That night, as I reviewed the footage from the security cameras I'd had recently installed, my stomach dropped. There she was, Judith, in the dead of night, standing in my driveway with two strong men in construction vests. One of them used bolt cutters to snap the chain, while Judith stood by, clipboard in hand, directing the operation. I stared at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't just about the chain anymore. Judith had crossed a line. The next homeowner association meeting couldn't come fast enough. I spent the week leading up to it preparing. I downloaded the footage onto my laptop and rehearsed what I'd say. Determined to expose Judith's actions in front of everyone. If she wanted to play dirty, fine, but she wasn't going to get away with it. When the meeting finally arrived, I showed up early to secure a seat near the front. The room filled quickly, and Judith, as usual, took her place at the head of the table, exuding her typical air of superiority. She began the meeting with a long-winded speech about community cohesion and the importance of respecting homeowner association leadership, which I assumed was a not-so-subtle jab at me. When the floor opened for questions, I raised my hand. "I have something I'd like to share with the group," I said, standing up and moving toward the projector. Judith's eyes narrowed, but she didn't stop me. I connected my laptop and queued up the footage. As soon as the video started playing, the room fell silent. The grainy black and white recording clearly showed Judith and her accomplices cutting the chain in my driveway. The timestamp in the corner made it impossible to deny. The murmurs started before the video even finished. People whispered to each other, glancing at Judith with a mix of shock and disapproval. When the footage ended, I turned to face her. "Care to explain this, Judith?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Judith's face flushed a deep crimson. "That footage is misleading," she stammered. "The chain was a violation of homeowner association guidelines. I was simply enforcing the rules." I raised an eyebrow. At midnight with bolt cutters. The room erupted in murmurs again, and for the first time I saw cracks in Judith's armor. Her usual commanding presence faltered as more neighbors began speaking up. One after another, people shared their own grievances, unjust fines, vague explanations for rising fees, and an overall lack of transparency. It was clear that I wasn't the only one Judith had crossed. Despite the uproar at the meeting, the Homeowner Association board ultimately decided to review the footage before taking any measures. Translation: they weren't going to do a damn thing. Frustrated, I realized I needed to take matters into my own hands. That's when I remembered Michelle. Michelle was a local investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering small-town scandals. She'd shattered stories about corrupt city council members, suspicious business dealings, and even a county sheriff with ties to organized crime. If anyone could help me expose Judith, it was her. I reached out to Michelle through her website, explaining the situation and attaching the footage. To my surprise, she called me back within an hour. "This is wild," she said, her voice crackling with energy. "Homeowner association corruption isn't uncommon, but this, cutting chains in the middle of the night, that's next level." I mean, over the next few weeks, Michelle and I dug into public records, homeowner association financial statements, and anything else we could get our hands on. What we found was worse than I'd imagined. Michelle's investigation revealed a tangled web of dishonesty. At the center of it all was a shell corporation owned by Judith's husband, the building company that had been causing so much trouble. They'd been making payments to this shell corporation in exchange for Judith steering lucrative renovation contracts their way. It didn't stop there. Homeowner association funds, which were supposed to be used for neighborhood improvements, had been siphoned off for personal expenses. Judith had been using the money to finance vacations, home renovations, and even a new car that the neighborhood upgrades she touted at meetings were nothing more than a diversion. Michelle published her findings in a scathing expose titled "Suburban Scandal Homeowner Association Presidents." Deceit exposed. The article went viral locally, and within days, reporters started swarming the neighborhood. Judith's once loyal followers began to distance themselves, and the rumors of dissent grew louder. But Judith wasn't going down without a fight. In fact, she seemed more determined than ever to make my life miserable. One evening, I noticed a drone hovering outside my living room window. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor's kid messing around, but when the drone came back multiple times over the next hour, I knew something was off. Then came the fire. It happened late one night. I woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling embers. My backyard shed, a small, weathered structure I used to store gardening tools, was engulfed in fire. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late to save it. The security footage confirmed my worst fears. The same two contractors who had helped Judith cut the chain were caught on camera sneaking into my backyard with a gas canister. It was incendiarism, plain and simple. Furious, I called the police that night. Armed with the security footage, I handed everything over to the authorities. By the next morning, all three of them, Judith and her accomplice, had been arrested. Later that afternoon, with Judith in custody, I decided to confront her spouse in front of the neighbors. He was standing outside with a few others, likely trying to smooth over the growing unease in the community. I walked right up to him, holding a printout of the incriminating security footage in my hand. Your wife, I began, my voice carrying enough force to silence the murmuring group, has crossed every line imaginable. He frowned, looking at me with a mix of confusion and irritation. What are you talking about? I shoved the screenshot into his hands. His eyes darted over the image, his face paling as realization hit. The neighbors crowded closer, craning their necks to see Judith and her little henchman. I continued, addressing not just him, but everyone present have already been arrested. The contractors confessed everything to the police. She orchestrated all of it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The neighbors, who had once followed Judith without question, now looked at her husband with open disdain. Someone muttered, I knew something was off about her, while another whispered, how did we let her get away with so much? Judith's husband stammered, this can't be true. Judith would never. Oh, it's true. I cut in, my voice rising. Not just the arson. She's been exposed for fraud and embezzlement. Your wife has been robbing this community blind. And now, you're all going to jail. He dropped the printout like it had burned him, his face a mixture of shock and fury. I didn't know, he started, but I didn't let him finish. You knew enough, I snapped. The shell companies, the stolen funds, it's all coming out now. And guess what? The police are investigating you too. By the time the police returned to search Judith's house for more evidence, the neighborhood had turned against her and her family entirely. Her once loyal followers had abandoned her, and as her husband was taken in for questioning, no one lifted a finger to help. A few days after Judith's arrest and her husband's release on bail following his questioning, I thought things had finally started to settle down. The neighborhood was quieter, and the media frenzy outside Judith's house had died down, at least for the moment. But that peace shattered late one night. When I heard the crunch of gravel outside my home, I glanced out the window and saw a familiar car parked in front of my house. My stomach twisted as I recognized the man stepping out, Judith's husband. He moved quickly up my walkway, his broad shoulders set with purpose, anger practically radiating off of him. He'd just been released on bail, and now he was here, clearly ready to try to intimidate me. I grabbed my phone and opened my security camera app, ensuring everything was recording before opening the door. I cracked it just enough to see him, keeping the chain lock in place. What do you want? I asked, my voice calm but edged with irritation. He leaned in, his face barely an inch from the door, and growled, you're going to drop all of this? The accusations, the footage, everything. You don't know who you're dealing with. I stared at him unfazed. You mean your wife, the one who's been arrested on multiple charges? Or you, who's out on bail for fraud and conspiracy? Who exactly am I supposed to be afraid of here? His jaw tightened and his eyes burned with barely restrained rage. You think this is over? You're playing a dangerous game. If you don't back off, there will be consequences. I raised my phone, holding it up where he could see the recording indicator. You mean the consequences of me sending this footage to the police? Because I'm pretty sure threatening a witness violates your bail conditions. His face went pale for a moment, then twisted into a sneer. You're making a mistake, he said, stepping back. I stood my ground as he walked back to his car, his threats hanging in the air. The moment he drove off, I called the police, reporting the intimidation attempt and providing them with the footage. Then I forwarded everything to Michelle, who wasted no time documenting the latest escalation in what was quickly becoming a full-blown scandal. The legal aftermath played out like a slow-motion train wreck. Judith's husband's late-night visit combined with the overwhelming evidence already stacked against him and his wife sealed their fate. His violation of bail conditions led to an immediate arrest, and this time, he didn't get out. The courtroom proceedings were intense. Judith faced charges of embezzlement, vandalism, and orchestrating the arson of my shed. Her husband's charges were just as severe, tying him to money laundering and his role in setting up the shell corporation used to funnel illicit funds. The contractors, eager to minimize their own sentences, testified against Judith and her husband, recounting every instruction she'd given them and admitting their roles in carrying out the arson and vandalism. The construction company executives, desperate to avoid harsher consequences, also pled guilty to bribery and fraud. They faced heavy fines, were barred from operating in the region, and saw their company's reputation permanently destroyed. Testifying in court was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life, but it was also rewarding. I recounted everything from the driveway chain to the fire and the intimidation attempt. The verdicts were unanimous. Judith received a lengthy prison sentence for her crimes, and her spouse wasn't far behind. The building company executives, though spared jail time, faced significant fines and business restrictions that effectively ended their careers. With Judith and her spouse out of the picture, the home owner association shifted its focus to rebuilding. The first order of business was dismantling the old home owner association structure and holding new elections. This time, everything was transparent, with residents voting on candidates they trusted. To prioritize the community's well-being over personal gain, one of the first decisions made by the new board was to overturn Judith's arbitrary fines and refund wrongfully charged residents. Policies were rewritten to include clear guidelines and enforce limits on the homeowner association's authority. A new rule was implemented requiring any changes to local fees or projects to be approved through a community vote. For the first time, residents felt empowered to participate in the decision-making process. The board also prioritized long overdue neighborhood improvements. The sidewalks were repaired, street lights were replaced, and the local park, which had been neglected for years, was finally renovated. These projects, funded with the recovered home owner association funds, brought the community together in a way I hadn't seen since moving in. To my surprise, several neighbors approached me about joining the new home owner association board. At first, I hesitated. After everything I'd been through, the idea of taking on that responsibility felt exhausting. But I realized that if I didn't step up, I might regret it. So I agreed to serve a one-year term focused on making sure the changes we'd fought for were fully implemented. By the time my term ended, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. The tension and division that Judith had fostered were gone, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. People who had once been too afraid to speak up now voiced their opinions openly, knowing they wouldn't be silenced or punished. When I stepped down from the board, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The neighborhood was finally the kind of place I dreamed of when I first moved in. The scars of the past few months were beginning to fade.